Welcome to another episode of My Dog Will Eat My Face. There were some technical issues, basically, to put it shortly, in the last week when I tried to push a draft version. Well, I didn't try to push. I accidentally pushed a draft version of my podcast out that was far less than cheery. It's really not my style. My problem with depression and sadness is I get really bored with it. So, it's very difficult for me to fall into any sort of deep depression no matter what. But, beyond that out of the way, housekeeping out of the way, there have been some very serious and dreadful changes that have been proposed with respect to my health care. And because of those changes, I am not so sure how long I intend to simply just keep this podcast going any further. And that is really because I feel so cornered, so isolated, and that things are going to get so much worse. It's far beyond the point of trying to endure it. In fact, the only thing keeping me from doing something that would otherwise be stupid, and I'm not talking about harming myself or others. There's none of that, so get that out of your head. I'm talking about, things to where I really go out of my way to, I guess, help myself. And to remain positive in any sense whatsoever with respect to my ongoing health care. And it's a really mixed bag of what you would think is maybe good news. I mean, some of it flat out is good news. But the consequences of that, strangely, are possibly going to put me in very dire straits that will be very difficult for me to even begin to live through. So, in this week's podcast, I'm going to try to discuss those at detail. And I hope my listeners understand where I'm coming from, where what first sounds like good news is actually filling me with just petrified fear. And I'll have to explain why. So, I guess buckle in and we'll try to sit through this as best I can, because this is going to be probably one of the most difficult podcasts that I have ever given. And it also may be one of the very last podcasts I'm going to be able to deliver on this topic. Now, I think journaling so to speak, is incredibly invaluable, and that's really my main purpose for the podcast. It wasn't ever really designed to really help others per se. I know it has helped others here and there. But it was my version of just taking the time to self-reflect and see where that leads me. And secondarily to that, to also have my voice and my thoughts recorded for all of time, basically. You know, there's the old joke, once it's on the internet, it's out there forever. But make that available to my loved ones and family for once I am passed. So, it might simply be a podcast, perhaps in a different form or continued as it is. I just don't know, to be honest. And I will know a week from today, actually. But it's got me driven down to terrible despondency. And unfortunately, that's going to be the topic for today's podcast. And I know not where this self-analysis will lead me, as I rarely ever do. Most of the time it leads me to some sort of means to get from point A to point B, to find happiness, for example, to redefine myself, to alter my viewpoint with respect to life and death itself. No small issues, for sure. But on the outset, I can't think of anything positive coming out of these events. Perhaps in just a few minutes, I'll be pleasantly surprised. But I may also be even worse off than I was before. So, with that said, I am going to talk in further detail as to what is actually going on physically with me. And unfortunately, because of that, what's going on with me, I don't even know what to call it. Almost politically, I can't think of a good term for it. But anyway, later on you'll know what I mean, and you can call it whatever you want. I struggle with what to call it. But anyway, maybe you're smarter than me and you'll think of a great name or a great descriptor of it and a nice elevator pitch and prove to everyone that I'm an idiot. I'm open to that. I want to be an idiot with lots of what I'm about to share. If my conclusions prove to be totally wrong, I would be extraordinarily happy. But my gut and what little intelligence I have filtering through from my hospice carrier seems to indicate that I am just weeks away from utter and complete hell. You might disagree. So, if you're on Spotify, I'll try to open up the feedback. I don't know what you would call it, feedback option, to where listeners can leave comments to the content creator. But that would only be available on Spotify. It wouldn't be on Apple and Google and all the other major platforms. So, with that said, if you have a brilliant idea of how to approach this, hopefully you have a brilliant idea of reaching out to me and sending me a message and explaining to me where I'm wrong. So, without further ado, hang on to your butts, because this is going to be very difficult for me to talk about and lead down a very unusual rabbit hole. I have to call it unusual because it's so twisted and at face value wouldn't make any sense. So, stay with me and I'll soon explain the extraordinarily difficult and complex issues that I have been faced with the past couple weeks and why I've not really found the time to post a new episode. So, here we go. Okay, so let me explain a little bit of history here. Now, as many of you may know, I've been creating a podcast on heart failure. I hate that preposition on. I just do. It sounds so clumsy. So I've created a podcast with respect to my congestive heart failure. There, I feel much better. And that started essentially not long after my cardiologist, who frankly I trust implicitly and explicitly with my life, for he has gone out of his way to literally save my life on probably 3 separate occasions. I would not be here today, nor would I have had the experiences, the good experiences I've had in life. Well, at least some of them, not all of them certainly, but at least some of them in my later life, if it were not for him. So, I have to start with the time when I was basically put into hospice care right away, not palliative care or anything like that. I went from working full-time, having a career, to bam, hospice care. So, I think it's important to remind those who already know how that happened, and also to explain it for those who may have never heard how that came to be. I'll try to be brief. I'm laughing at myself for saying that because I'm the least brief person I know. Anyway, So, quite some time ago, years ago, I was working full-time in my job in a law department, and it was Friday, just before the weekend, and I, like so many other professionals, I guess, in the universe, spent the day working at home. Because then I could spend it with my dog at the time. I say at the time because he's since passed away, unfortunately, that dog. But, it gave me time to spend with him. And also, I find, like, maybe the last couple hours, pretty much anything after the lunch period in a professional employment position on a Friday is kind of like moot. No one really wants to work anymore. They're all looking forward to the weekend. So I was no exception. I was working at home. I mean, I was being productive, but I did not go to the office, which was only 10 minutes away from me. And decided instead to just work from home, chillax, spend time with my dog, have a nice lunch, and get the weekend kind of started off on a right vibe. And honestly, that's something I would not always, I guess, but that's something I would frequently do given the chance. Because the fact of the matter is, there have been so many other Fridays where something crazy happens on a Friday afternoon, like 4 p.m. Friday, and I'm suddenly served a search warrant from the Secret Service for something. You know, it's the running joke of, I think, anyone who works full-time in a career. Of course, the crazy, stupid stuff likes to all blow up in everybody's face on Friday afternoon. But that being said, if it is a slow Friday, I have no qualms about taking it a little slow. And being a little chill and just, you know, I mean, obviously still doing my job, but kind of with one foot out the door to start the weekend, shall we say. So, at this time, again, this is going back years and years and years ago, probably, I want to say 6 to 7 years ago, so we're reaching back. I was on home supplemental oxygen. I honestly do not remember what my liter flow was at the time, but I would only wear the oxygen at night, not during the day. And of course, when I traveled for work, which was pretty much every other week at the time, I just would forego it. Because oxygen concentrators are about 80 pounds. I'm not hauling that through TSA. Known traveler or not. That would be quite an obnoxious piece of collateral to bring with me. So, I did have an oxygen concentrator in my walk-in closet in the bedroom, and I would just normally crack it on when I felt like I was short of breath because maybe I had like an acute illness, or just because I would wear it only at night. Well, on this particular Friday, it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I want to say it was pretty late in the day. At this point, most people had already checked out. That's just pretty common. So, I was still making myself available to the business unit I was supporting and doing what I had to do. But there came a moment to when I felt extraordinarily short of breath. Like, I felt like I just could not breathe. To the point of just very nearly gasping for air. I wasn't that bad, but whatever stage is right below that, that's pretty much where I was. And so I decided to lay down. Hey, I was working at home. I could lay down for 10 minutes and just put my away message up for a bit. So I decided to do that, and I decided to put on my home oxygen regardless, because I was short of breath. And nothing I did seemed to remedy the situation in any way whatsoever. And I've got a pulse oximeter that I keep with me in my home because I like to measure where I'm at with my pulse and my oxygen rate. And the oxygen rate was absolutely stunning. It was, I think they say average for a really healthy person is 97%. That's pretty much where I was landing, if not higher, up to 98 or even 99. So I just really was puzzled by that. Why do I feel so severely short of breath? Like I just could not breathe. Yet when I checked the numbers, I was breathing a ton. It really did not make any sense to me. So I returned to my desk at home and continued to work on a few things that were just some small outstanding fires I had to put out. And that feeling not only persisted, it got worse. I actually started to feel a substantial sense of doom. And I was, at that point, obviously quite scared. So scared, in fact, I just knew. I knew there was something wrong, even though I couldn't tell you what. I just knew that there was a massive, major problem within my heart and lungs right now. Something's going on. I don't know what. Numbers aren't making sense. And I've got the overwhelming dread, which they do say is a prelude very often to a heart attack. So it is about that point where I just finally called 911. And I stayed on the phone with them until the paramedics, of course, arrived. And at one point, when I was just sitting there in a chair waiting for the paramedics to show up, I noticed that the seat I was sitting in was just completely soaked. It was just completely wet. So immediately, I blamed my dog. I said, "Oh, that stupid dog, he probably got scared because I was scared, and then he just peed the chair." Oh, God bless it. I was very frustrated, needless to say, because it seemed like I just sat in a puddle of dog pee. But I guess I took a closer look when trying to inspect my jeans to see just how bad it was stained through or gone through. And I realized that I was soaked and wet. It wasn't the dog at all. I'm the one who peed the chair. And I had no sensation whatsoever. No sensation at all. So, that was, needless to say, pretty terrifying. And I knew that my jeans were soaked and wet because of my own pee, and that paramedics were en route. So, with what energy I had, I went ahead and changed my underwear and pants to retain some level of dignity for when these paramedics showed up, and I did successfully change my pants. But yeah, I basically just I had a massive, first time ever, full-blown case of incontinence where I had no sensation. That I had to pee, that I was peeing, anything. But yet, there I was, fully soaked. Well, I successfully changed my clothes to something dry just before the paramedics arrived, thankfully. So I explained to them what was going on, and they decided to put me on a gurney and take me to the hospital. And I'm going along with it because I don't know what's going on, obviously. And then all of a sudden, I started signaling to large pieces of Tupperware in the kitchen to the EMS teams, pointing, unable to talk, to the plastic Tupperware, just fiercely pointing at it, like, give me that Tupperware, give me that Tupperware. And they quickly discerned that I had to throw up. And they brought me the Tupperware, and then I just lost everything. My lunch that day, which was pho, which does not feel so good coming out. And I just basically lost everything I ate that day. So it was kind of like my body was going through the shutdown process, relieving itself without notice, throwing up whatever was left above the certain threshold. And then, of course, I was taken to the hospital. Now, when I was in the hospital, they didn't really do anything for me, to be perfectly honest. I just kind of rested there and got better, but not through anything that they did. It just slowly got better on its own. So eventually, I'm sitting in my bed all by myself, watching the TV, and the nurse is in there, filling out their silly little whiteboard in the hospital, as many of you may be familiar. And my cardiologist, who I already mentioned, that I implicitly and explicitly trust with my life, suddenly just walked in the room. And I was actually very happy to see him because I have a tremendous amount of respect for the man and what he thinks needs to be done. And so I greeted him happily. And at the same time, the nurse was there filling out her stupid whiteboard stuff, you know. This is my shift now. I'm your nurse, so-and-so. If you need anything, call me at this extension. Do-do-do-do-do. My star sign is Aquarius. No, they didn't give me that. But just whatever stuff they write up on the whiteboard for you when you're in the hospital. And my cardiologist turned to look at the nurse and said, "Can you leave us some privacy, please?" And the nurse said, "Sure," and quickly left. And I was thinking to myself, that cannot be good. For your cardiologist to enter and to kick out your nurse for privacy purposes to talk to you, that's never a good sign. And I was right. He said that they'd finally identified what the problem was with this event. And what happened was, according to him, I went into right ventricle failure. And in short, there's nothing more they can do about it to help me. And at that moment, he gave me approximately 3 years to live. I asked him at that point, "So, are you saying I should be making final arrangements?" He nodded and said yes. And that was that. He then excused himself and left the room, and then I was just left sitting there by myself in this hospital room with that news delivered to me. I guess so rather bluntly. And most certainly completely alone in my thoughts and feelings. And that was very rough. Now, shortly thereafter, I didn't know what to do. What am I supposed to do with this information? So, I went back to work on Monday, and I was discharged from the hospital. I was just returned to work. I didn't know what else to do. And then I had a follow-up visit with him. I can't remember how far back it was from that event, but that's when he said, "I think you really need to be moved to hospice care." And that, my friends, was my ta-da grand entry into hospice care for congestive heart failure. But there's still one huge problem. Not like that in and of itself isn't a problem. But there's also another major flaw with the details that I had been given. And just to keep it, I guess, short and sweet, I did move to hospice care. But I have been in hospice care ever since, with absolutely worsening of cases. And I firmly believe it's been a series of bad events after bad events, medically speaking. But it also meant that I probably made a few records, including my single album called Staying Alive. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. I made a few records with time spent in hospice. And that came out, I guess, to now to be a whopping 4.5 years. Sure, every hospice extension was warranted due to a worsening condition, but it's been very slow and arduous, as I've already described before. And this now leads me to my current crisis. So, again, at first glance, things have been relatively stable for years, but my physical condition has indeed worsened over those years too, warranting extensions for each hospice stay. Well, just recently, my hospice provider got a new what is the title? Medical director. Started February 19th. Her name is Dr. Bennett, Kimberly Bennett. And she came with my nurse one day to talk to me, and she basically, the whole time, belabored the point of how difficult the federal guidelines are for hospice, and how it's not meant for continuous care, but just for people that are getting worse and worse and worse every 3 months. And from then, I realized that I could very well be SOL. Because I, unfortunately, have become so dependent upon hospice care that for me to jettison out of it is absolutely terrifying. And frankly, might be fatal. It seemed that all of my complaints landed upon deaf ears. And furthermore, I had some additional blood work done that is called BPN, not to be confused with BPM, which is just a basic metabolic, or BMP, not to be confused with BMP, that's just a basic metabolic panel. What I'm trying to get done, what I did get done, was a BNP, which analyzes damage enzymes released by the heart, indicative of fluid retention and things of that nature. Back in 2022, that BNP came in at an extraordinarily high, that is bad, level. So normal range for BNP is 100. And I have no clue what they're measuring there. I don't know if it's 100 MEQs of Scooby-Doo to the Aquarius star system. I have no clue what that is, to be honest. But I do know that the normal human being is 100 or lower. In 2022, I registered at 1,900 and plus and some change. Then I had another test done very recently to kind of see where it's going and kind of gauge how bad things are and their velocity. Well, the impossible happened. It had dropped from 1,900 and then some to below the average rate of 100 and is now rated as excellent. Now, you would probably find that to be good news, right? But I am just so dependent upon hospice. Having been in it for 5 years or so, I am totally dependent upon my counseling through hospice, my medications, my medication deliveries, everything. My PCP is now in hospice. All of it is in hospice. So I am absolutely terrified of what's going to happen if they try to move me to palliative care. I foresee that there is no doctor in their right mind, and beyond that, even granted that, no pharmacist in their right mind at Duane Reade or I don't know, CVS or something that would fill the medications that I have in hospice. Because, friends, I'm going to confess here, I am on a very high dose of narcotics because it's extremely painful. I suffer from edema that is some of the worst pain in my life, and I'm suffering more and more from neuropathy, which is very painful. And so they've controlled my pain very well, but with a very high dose of narcotics. And also some benzos, relatively light benzos, and sleeping medication. I'm not too worried about those two. Those are kind of run-of-the-mill. But I don't see any doctor or any pharmacist ever in today's so-called opioid crisis fulfilling my various medications. Just weekly, I get 96 pills of 5 milligram Oxycontin, as well as 48 pills of 30 milligram immediate release morphine, as well as a fentanyl patch. That's right, kids. I am actually prescribed the big, bad, evil fentanyl. There is no doctor that's going to prescribe that. So basically all what hospice has done for me is got me rapidly hooked on these medications. And then now they're going to drop kick me to the wolves and suffer the worst withdrawal symptoms ever imaginable. I guess that's their plan. And yeah, in case you haven't noticed, I'm very angry. That means my pain is going to get worse. It's already barely tolerable. And I'm going to have withdrawals that, frankly, at times are going to be worse than death. So I am absolutely not happy to switch to palliative care, which I know it means through some miracle or another, my body's been healing. But it's been healing because of those medications. At least in part. There's a few other less than healthy activities I've since stopped doing, such as drinking heavily. I used to be a real heavy drinker, okay? Yeah. I'm totally open about that. I was a pretty heavy drinker. And then, like, one day when I was in hospice, I ran out of vodka, and I just never bothered to get a refill. And I don't tell people I don't drink, because that was never a conscious, really, decision. It just sort of happened organically. Because I knew I was going to be on medications that, when mixed with booze, could spell nightmare. So I took them as directed, and somehow I just quit drinking for the most part. I've had a few drinks with dinner here and there, but that's it. And that alone has probably expanded my lifespan by years. That alone has probably changed things. But now I'm terrified. Are things going to go back to the way they were? Because no doctor and no pharmacist is going to be willing to fill those orders. I just don't see it. Maybe 80 years ago, 100 years ago, yeah. But now, no. I also have to have a new PCP. And here's the other thing. I'm still fainting on an almost daily basis. I stopped driving on my own. I chose to quit driving because I had the thought, what if I faint when driving and plow into a child or held a dog or something? I would never be able to live with myself. Ever. So I just took that off the equation. I used to love driving. I had a nice car. I loved it. It was a black BMW 3 Series. It was a great vehicle. But I sold it. And now for me to travel, I'm reliant on at least 8 liters of oxygen. And I live in a big city. So to get to and fro and wait in line, we're talking upwards to 2 to 3 hours maybe. How in God's name am I going to get there, for one, and two, haul around oxygen tanks to allow me to breathe? I have no earthly idea. So, yeah, I should be happy that I guess my body decided to heal itself. To some extent. I mean, it's not all roses and sunshine. I mean, I do still have congestive heart failure. But death is no longer apparently what they're going to say. It's my guess that it's just no longer imminent. You've been here for 5 years, dude. We can't keep doing this. And so I will be kicked to the wolves to fend for myself. And I could, because of just that, very well die. And that terrifies me. I'm not terrified of death. I'm terrified of a stupid death. I'm terrified of dying of something that is completely manageable and avoidable. But it's not my choice. It's this new medical director's choice, who, by the way, didn't see the benefit of one medication I'd been on for years for pulmonary hypertension, which is what led to the congestive heart failure. And she refused to prescribe it. So my cardiologist at my other hospital, I still keep in contact with them, had to call her and tell her that she's an idiot. Well, in not so many words, but say, prescribe it. Yeah, he's serious. He's taken it for years. It will help him. And this is a medical doctor. Granted, she's not a cardiologist, but still. And she only started with the company February 19th. And I met her, I want to say almost 3 weeks ago now. So, she is making these decisions purely based on CYA. Doesn't know me from Adam. And then, in fact, when she first met me, she got my first name wrong. Well, actually, not when she first met me. It was like after a while of her lecturing me on the federal guidelines. And then she called me Stephen. I mean, come on. You're making decisions about my life that could literally save me or kill me, and you don't even bother to get the name right. So I say I would not trust her any further that I could throw her. But based on recent intelligence that I have, they are going to jettison me off of hospice altogether. And I don't know how that will be handled. Now, if they could find a doctor, a PCP, that would prescribe all those drugs as they are, then it would still suck because I'd lose things like my counselor. But if my medications remain unchanged, I think I could handle that. But I guarantee you that's not going to be the case. And in fact, when I spoke to my social worker about it this morning, she said point blank, I have to do the diligence to call these potential PCPs and select one. Not knowing if they would ever prescribe my meds. And even if they did, I can't imagine a run-of-the-mill pharmacy prescribe my meds either. Because right now in hospice, it's hand-delivered to me. And they specialize in hospice care. There's no pushback like at Walgreens, like, ew, I'm going to call your doctor and verify this. I don't feel comfortable prescribing. There's none of that. None in hospice prescriptions. So, it's going to be frankly a total disaster. I think I should change my name to Katrina Hindenburg, because this is going to be such a disaster. And now they've got a scheduled call for Wednesday, the 17th, to discuss all this at my house and with my family all at once. And I'm sure it's going to be a disaster. I don't know if I will be strong enough to throw these people out of my home. Because what they're doing is severe damage. Just severe damage. And that's why I slipped, and some of you might have seen it. There was another podcast that got released, but it was actually just a draft. And so I pulled it back, but not for a day later, so it might even be out there still. But I called it All is Lost. And let me explain, though, why I used that phrase in particular to describe this situation. So, the podcast that was erroneously published, thankfully it was nothing bad. It was just a first attempt, and it wasn't obviously a whole episode. So yeah, I do sometimes scratch different versions or segments and what have you. Anyway, that one was called All is Lost. Because, dear listener, that is how I feel right now. I don't feel happy at all about being moved to palliative care, if that's what they do. When at face value, you would think that'd be worthy of a party. The fact of the matter is, I don't believe for a moment I am out of the woods. And I'm sorry, federal government, if I can't conform to your guidelines when it comes to my death. Because what they're really saying is, you're not dying fast enough. So, yeah, mea culpa, mea culpa. Doesn't mean it's not happening. Doesn't mean every 3 months conditions have indeed worsened. But now I've got a new medical director who has a wild bug up her butt, who pretty much made her decision with respect to me before she even knew anything about me or met me. So I have very little respect for her at all. And to say all is lost right now is absolutely how I feel. I mean, I don't feel good about a transition at all because I don't think it's warranted, and I don't think I would survive it. From the lack of appropriate medication to the withdrawals, possibly. And that's something I didn't ask for. I took my medication as I was directed. I don't see a pharmacy or a physician filling those kinds of medications at all anytime soon in today's universe. I'd have a better chance in 1890 than I did today. So yes, to me, right now, all is lost. It's over. And that's why I say this may be one of my last podcasts for all of time. Now, if you listeners feel that I have some sort of value to try to keep posting, definitely let me know and I'll consider it. How do you let me know? Well, that's a tough question to answer. I'm going to try to open up the comment section for this podcast so you can reply to that. But that only works on Spotify. So then again, I might not do that because that's only allowing a small portion of listeners to chime in. But I don't know. If you're listening to this podcast, here's what I'll say. You obviously have my proper name. Just go to LinkedIn. Look me up on there. I think that's the only social media presence I have. And from there, you can send me a message. So that's one way to do it. If you know my email address, you can do that. If you become a patron, of course, you can message me that way. So there's a number of different ways people can tell me if they still see value in this. And I would like to know if that's the case. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying this is the final podcast. I find out, I guess, what my future is, so to speak, 1 week from today. And I hope, at least, I post something with respect to that when it becomes available to me. I am absolutely terrified that this is going to lead me down a very dark, dark pit of despair. And not one of liberation. I will be totally honest and literally say the only thing I've got going for me today is my emotional support animal, my dog, who helps me through thick and thin, through every possible event imaginable. And I'm coming from a position to where I can't leave him. He doesn't deserve that. And he doesn't deserve me to be horribly hurting through withdrawals or something. So I'm quite paralyzed with what to do. However, let me briefly discuss why I pick "all is lost" as an appropriate mantra in this case. That was a phrase uttered by none other than Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. Frederick the Great once said, "All is lost." And the reason why I chuckle a little bit, we don't call him the Great because he's a great loser or something like that. He was, at the time, engaged in not only the fight for his life, but for the unification of his country of Prussia. And he did actually say, because he was in such a beleaguered and seemingly hopeless position, that he did say, or write, I guess I don't know which came first, "All is lost," reflecting his despair. Now, the reason I find it as a useful quote here is that there's still a glimmer of hope. Because you see, "all is lost" was mentioned again by someone who became one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. And that's actually quite why I made a note of that quote. Because sometimes, in the darkest of corners, when things look the most absolute bleak, your assessment of how dire the situation is may indeed be fair. But you might also prevail and be very pleasantly surprised. So that's why I actually like that quote. It's not a downer to me. To say "all is lost" and refer to Frederick is a reminder that here was a great military genius thinking indeed, all was lost. But in the end, he prevailed and won. And was grossly mistaken. Things were not lost at all. So in a really kind of twisted way, when you know the background of that story, of why he said it, when he said it, it's actually kind of a phrase that, for me, at least, offers a glimmer of hope. So, truly, at this point, it seems like all is lost. But I just don't know what could happen to me. And ergo, that's why I was relatively silent for a few weeks here. I apologize for that. I was hoping some conclusion out of it could be delivered. But to this day, I still got squat. Except for the latest intelligence that I've picked up on. And I'm not going to get into how and why and who, where I got it from. But it appears that the worst case scenario for me is indeed soon to happen. And with that, I will try to at least keep my listeners well posted. I think here I'm going to probably stumble a little bit off the regular Tuesday wee hours of the morning release, as I am today. But it's only because I'm trying to get the best information I can out there. And frankly, right now, I am beyond flabbergasted. I can't imagine how I will endure what may be a vicious calamity. So, with that discombobulated mess of emotions that I've dumped on your doorstep and lit it afire, rang the bell, and ran away from, I think I'm going to leave this podcast where it's at now. So, I've pretty much shared as much as I possibly could. And certainly all of the pertinent information that's available. So, I certainly would welcome any feedback from anyone if I should continue to do this podcast regardless. Because I'm a big fan of journaling. That's what this has been for me. So it would certainly be no sweat off my sleeve to essentially keep it going through journaling, I guess. But there's going to be a pretty long hiatus to where I am just mortified beyond words. And I don't know how to overcome it. But anyway, for this week, I think that pretty much sums up where I'm at. And where I've been the last few weeks. So the real good news, I guess, is I didn't die on all yet. I am still kicking. And frankly, I guess also the good news is it seems that the unthinkable, the overcoming that no one expected may have actually occurred. You have to understand, when I was first put in hospice care, unbeknownst to me, I found this out years ago, actually. Or, that's not right. Years later. I found this out years later. But when I first entered hospice, the hospice team itself gave to my family approximately 2 weeks to live. So that's a pretty heavy-duty extension. From 2 weeks to 5 years to being kicked out. So in a way, it's certainly the best thing you could ever ask for, actually. But the change is something that, frankly, I am just absolutely terrified of. Just I don't even know where to begin. Well, I already have begun. I told you pretty much everything in my head. Anything that I left out, they're just kind of fleeting thoughts that maybe come and go periodically, but I definitely served on up a full-on meal of the issues that I foresee at hand. And, oh man, I hope I'm wrong. I hope it's as simple as magic just to move my meds over to a palliative care team. And I get a PCP, just sits there and slaps my butt for me for some reason. I don't know. I don't even understand the purpose of PCPs anymore. Anyway, and life goes on. That's what I want. Well, at least that last bit, that's happening. Life will go on with or without change, with or without me. So, I'm just absolutely beyond words terrified of what's going to happen to me. So if you've made it this far in this recording, I do dearly thank you. You've given me, frankly, the most I could ask for. Well, technically the most I could ask for is like $10 million too or something, but let's be reasonable. Yeah, and this is all happening at the exact same time as tax time, which always is a nightmare for me. The ancient Sumerians had a proverb that said, you could have a man, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. And that was going all the way back to the ancient Sumerians. I mean, that is pretty far back proverb. And back then, they even knew how annoying the IRS is. But anyway, it's my own fault. I always play tax shenanigans. Frankly, I've done it for years and years and years. Just how I am. And around tax time every year, I just feel like defenestrating myself. But, it will come and it will go too, like everything else, so. It just kind of sucks that that's happening at the exact same time as this hospice crud, which my term in hospice expires on April 18th, just 3 days after tax day. So it's like, great, they're all lined up perfectly to maximize my stress levels. God, thanks. But, in respect to all those various issues and ordeals with which I have to handle, I am reminded yet again of another quote, I believe, by the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. And that quote was, "He who defends everywhere defends nothing." Now, at first glance, it just seems like a happy little war tip, like at a Sun Tzu's book or something. But to me, it has a lot more meaning than that. When you are overwhelmed with so many changes, with so much flux that you are just at wit's end. And if you try to attack all of it at the same time, you're probably going to be so overwhelmed and so underperforming that it's like you never did anything at all. Rather, it's best to very diligently prioritize and focus on small but important points that need your attention. And when those get handled to satisfaction, that's when you move on to the next. You can't handle it all at once. And that's what I take out of that quote. I think it's also by Frederick. Those who defend everywhere defend nothing. And no matter how overwhelmed everything gets, I'm just going to have to remember that one little bit of wisdom. Now, just as a reminder though, because I am having these tax and financial issues, if you wish to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MyDogWillEatMyFace. Or you can go to the homepage for the podcast on Spotify and then select support this podcast. And of course, you can select follow and turn on notifications so you're told when a new podcast is published. So that might be more, I don't know what the word is, disjointed than it's ever been. Because I feel more apt to disclose what news I get as it becomes available. But we'll see. But thank you so much for just listening in and your listenership. I know I said the same thing twice. So I double mean it. And I sincerely thank you for that. But until we speak again, please wish me luck. And for now, it's just auf Wiedersehen.